We're going to try to do this today. We're going to try to read Chapter 8 of To Be Told by Dan B. Allender, Ph.D. God invites you to co-author your future. I'm Natalie. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherdess here on our little small hobby farm. And so when it's quiet, I love to read. And my flock doesn't like it when I'm ever quiet. So it is a beautiful journey and adventure for me always to not only read out loud, as I'm doing right now, and every day with these audiobooks I'm doing. It's beautiful to be able to speak out loud, even when there might not be other people around, because that's what your life is. You're the Good Shepherd. You are the lone shepherd. You do spend your life with animals more so than humans. So with that being said, and my little beaker down here delighting in finding new food, let's go ahead and jump into chapter number 8, Editing Together. Almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere, so start by getting something, anything, down on paper. One friend says the first draft is the down draft. You get it down. The second draft is the up draft. You fix it up. You try to say what you have to say more accurately. And the third draft is the dental draft, where you check every tooth to see if it's loose or cramped or decayed or even, God help us, healthy. Anne Lamott. A friend of mine read the first 7 chapters of this book and remarked, "Do you actually think I'm going to write?" I was baffled. Our conversation turned to his resistance to write a single word about his life. He said, "I enjoyed the book as long as I thought you were using the word write as a metaphor. But when it became clear you wanted me to actually write things down, I thought, forget it." Hey guys, listen, Frito. This man is a capable professional, bright and successful. He writes reports and client summaries every day, but for some reason, the moment he thought about writing about his life, he froze. He's not alone. The excuses for not writing are legion. I can't spell. My grammar is atrocious. I get bored. What's the point? Someone might read it. I don't have time. It seems so self-indulgent. My stories are painful. I feel too much when I write. The struggle is somewhat similar to praying, fasting, or giving away our goods because we don't do it well. We choose not to do anything at all. We have an image of good or even perfect writing or praying, fasting, giving. And since we can't achieve what we idealize, then it's just easier not to risk. My friend's reasons boiled down to these: frustration, futility, and fear. His frustration centered on the few times that he had written from his heart and discovered that he couldn't say what he felt. Each time he wrote, his words seemed flat and hollow compared to what he was experiencing. Writing is always a form of translation. We take what it is in us and bring it up from our heart through our mind to the page. That translation always leaves much unsaid. The labor to say it again better is agonizing. Many quit before the depth of their story rises in the words. My friend's frustration led to a feeling of futility. He said bluntly, "Why should I do something that is so hard and so guaranteed to fail?" The failure is not only in not saying something that is in accord with one's heart, but it also involves the futility of so what? Once I've written something about my life, so what? What am I to do with the new understanding of how hard it was to make the transition to the new school in 5th grade, or how painful it was to be humiliated in junior high gym class? Those tough periods in life are thankfully over. And the tough periods in life right now need action, not writing, to resolve. Writing feels pointless. It's difficult to respond to such questions. But my friend is a good athlete who works out regularly, so I compared writing to running. It seldom feels fantastic to run, but each day even a short run builds strength that is cumulative and energizes the body and mind to better tackle the demands of the day. Writing, even a few sentences or a few words, brings us face to face with our present life and calls us to engage in truths that are otherwise too easy to ignore. Then my friend admitted his reluctance really had far more to do with fear. None of us wants to dredge up the past, especially the hurt and tragedy and abuse we find there. And writing a sentence makes that reality of life harder to escape. My friend admitted that when he wrote even a few sentences about matters in his past, everything became more real. There is something about seeing your hurts and struggles in black and white that focuses the heart rather than allowing it to turn and flee. We are more naked and needy before words that we write than perhaps anywhere else. We fear this, so we avoid it. But reality is where God shows up. Reality may be painful, but if we want to meet God, we have to go there. Writing is a fearful and wonderful gift we give to God, an offering of sacrifice given in hope of redemption. We can write for hours or seconds. We can write a diary, journal, scenes, dreams, plans, essays, poetry, mission statements, lists, and letters to a deceased abuser, friend, parent, or God. The world changes the moment we write a sentence, because we can't write just one. One sentence, one honest series of words, whether grammatically correct or spelled well, calls forth its twin. 2 sentences ache for a third. If you write 3 sentences, you will inevitably write more. And once you are writing, you find that the kind of writing destined to tell the truth and direct your life must eventually be read by an editor. Ooh. We must submit our story, the writing of our life, to the reading of others. And we must do so with people we deeply trust. Otherwise, the naked experience of bearing our stories to another will bring shame and send us fleeing. A few years ago, I wrote a book called How the Children Raise Parents. The first time I read portions of that manuscript to a group, I found it far more difficult than I imagined. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I wondered how people would receive my words, and I found it nearly impossible to raise my eyes as I read. I was afraid to look at the group's expression. The experience is not a great deal different when a friend quietly reads in my presence something I've written. As I see his or her pen circle a word or cross out something I've written in the margin, I can't help but interrupt. So what do you think? It's humbling to invite another person to see and respond to your creation, and it's utterly imperative to do so if we want to know the truth about our story. My books have had the enormous care and generosity of editors who bring tears to my heart when I think about how they attended their labor. Each book has one professional editor assigned, but I've also been blessed to have many friends who read each chapter even before it lands on the editor's desk. These friends served as attendants to the birth, and each brought a lifetime of care to the process. A good editor, and any good reader of the early drafts, is a midwife. He or she is both tender enough not to shame the groaning or despise the blood, and strong enough to demand concentrated focus to push through the pain at the right season. A dear friend who reads and asks good, hard questions invites us to dig deeper, see the horizon, and press on to answer the question, so what? If we write a diary or a journal, seldom is there a need for a rewrite. That kind of writing underscores the rhythms of the day and our inner world, and it is a fodder for other kinds of writing. But when we write a scene from our life, or we work on naming the themes of our story, or we focus on a mission statement, then it is imperative that we write, rewrite, and rewrite the rewrite. Rewriting digs deeper into the soil of our story. That digging is important because all writing leaves gaps. These gaps hold a depth that can be explored only after repeated encounters. But entering into our story gaps requires an outside reading by a good editor who opens the text to a new reading. The new reading can give us a perspective that we did not see before. Judy, a student at Mars Hill Graduate School, met with me for a 20-minute office appointment. We had a lovely conversation, but she was so earnest and worked so hard to make sure each word was clear and well chosen that after 5 minutes I felt exhausted for her. I asked at one point, "Have you ever talked with anyone where you could relax and be young?" She seemed startled, but she regained her composure in the blink of an eye. I pressed just a little harder. "I suspect you've always been the most responsible and diligent person in your family. You don't seem to rest well." She didn't speak. She nodded her head. I asked, "What would it be like if, during your time with us at Mars Hill, you experimented with letting others be more responsible than you are? What would it be like to play, not earn straight A's, not be the first to answer a question, and perhaps even to mess up in ways you've never permitted yourself to in the past?" I talked with Judy a few months later. She told me that when we first spoke, I might as well have counseled her to abuse drugs, dye her hair pink, and work for the Communist Party. She was highly offended, and it took several weeks to name that something had stung her far beyond what she felt was my inaccurate reading of her life. But she began to look at her life in a new light. She was the oldest child in the family, and at a young age she realized her mother was flighty and dishonest. Her mother might tell a pointless lie or take a loaf of bread from the grocery store without paying for it. She might start reading a book and forget to prepare dinner for the family. Judy was her mother's safety net and her siblings' functioning parent. It wasn't a surprise that by age 24, Judy had already known success as a youth pastor, camp counselor, church secretary, and salesperson. She had already been picked to be the next women's ministry coordinator at her home church. Her calling seemed settled and clear. But my reading of her life, as well as my editorial questions and remarks, cast her into a quandary. She found herself asking, is this really my calling, or is it merely an opportunity to repeat the patterns of the past by being the most responsible person around? Judy's story is still evolving, but she has begun to write new paragraphs about what she wants to become rather than merely following the groove to a familiar, well-worn rut. She may end up being a women's ministry coordinator, or she may end up writing a brand new story for her life. Judy had invited me to read her life and enter her story to ponder its gaps and inconsistencies, the things that make little sense. She asked me to be an editor. A good editor draws out what is not said in order to give life to what was aborted before it saw the light of day. We need friends who will name what is unnamed in our story, so that that truth is told. A good editor also helps to ensure that we don't edit out the truth. And a good editor helps us consider the implications of what our story tells us about ourselves. A good friend is an editor who walks around our story in widening circles and at different heights to help us see not only where we have come from, but also where we might go. Editing takes us to our mission through the meaning of our story. For 16 years, I've been part of leading a week of reflection and recovery for men and women who have been sexually abused. It has been one of the greatest privileges of my life to see men and women face their histories of torment and join with others in grieving and raging against the darkness. These times have been profoundly transforming for everyone. Many of those who went through the one-week course asked if there could be a second week. This time, since I was in the midst of reflecting on story and the power of writing, I agreed. The dilemma was that now I would need to write about the abuse in my own history, just as I had asked the participants to do with their lives. I had written before about being abused, but I'd never written anything about the abuse itself. As I began to write, I experienced the flashbacks, nauseous rage, and profound fear. I even questioned whether the abuse had ever actually happened. To follow is the scene that I wrote that week. The cabin was no more than 300 square feet with 2 bunk beds on the sides and 2 desks at the back of the plank-floored space. We were in West Virginia. It was mid-June, and the windows were all mesh screens to keep out the mosquitoes. There were at least 8 cabins on each side. One row backed up to the river, and the other was 20 yards set back from the river row. The arrangement of cabins seemed to follow the plan of army barracks. The flagpole was at the head of the encampment, and I could hear the cloth stiffen and flutter late at night as the hot winds blew through our screens. The sound reminded me that tomorrow morning, no matter what happened in the dark, another day would rise, and we would all stand at attention and bark out the Pledge of Allegiance. It was always my hope that the morning would come and I'd have slept through the night, not being awakened by the creaking of the old springs in a bed or the low moan of breath quickening until it escaped in a final rush of fury. But night scared me for another reason. It was when the counselors told stories of past campers. It often began with the chiding and supercilious warnings not to leave the cabin after hours. No one was stupid enough to venture outside after lights off. Night after night, we heard the same story in different forms about campers who had ventured off to slide down the embankment to the river and were never found. 1 or 2 variations were told that included bodies mauled by some wild predator, bloated and pus-filled, floating down the river. It was enough to recall the horror of Jim and Huck coming upon the corpse in the rotted old boat. But when I considered that this could be my body that was discovered, I knew I would not only not leave the cabin, but I'd do whatever I was told so I could avoid such a fate. I was a pudgy, kinky-haired, pimply, young 11-year-old. I had discovered my penis only 4 months earlier during a camping trip when my Scoutsmaster had asked me to touch his erect member. It was as if I had awakened at that moment to a world that seemed to be phallic in plain view of everyone. I began to hear what I had never been aware of before: sexual humor, innuendos, taunts, and invitations. Hey, guys! Hey! It was as if the world had been speaking a language I had never heard until that moment. Through this act of initiation, I was not only given the ears to hear, but also a mouth that could speak. I was startled and repulsed, aroused and intrigued. Before I left home, For the camp in West Virginia, my dad had said, "Don't tell your mom that you'll be staying at camp 9 weeks. Once you get there, call us and beg us to let you stay, and I'll make it happen." I knew he was afraid of my mom, but I'd never realized he was so manipulative. I just played along. Once I arrived at the camp, I made the phone call. The die was cast, and soon afterward, I experienced my first moment of torture. Late at night, the boys in my cabin were forced to exit our beds and undress in front of the counselors. Our bodies were prodded and exposed by the riding crops the counselors used to make the camp's horses run with more gusto. Now, the same leather devices were used to humiliate and dehumanize us. We were to stand motionless, silent, and seemingly unaware of what was happening to the camper standing next to us. Then we were told to start running. A mass of naked boys, silhouetted by a broken moon, took off for the baseball fields. I was near the front because our cabin was second from the top, but within a short distance, the strong legs and thin bodies of my peers outran me, and I was soon near the back of the group. One of the counselors had taken off his whistle so he could whip me with the strap as he laughed at my slow pace. I ran as hard as I could. I could feel my loose tummy rock to and fro, and no matter how hard I willed or wished, I could not outrun my tormentor. The more he whipped, the harder I ran and the slower I became. The wind in my lungs heaved and became heavier, and my legs turned as I raced away from the pain. But what stung more than the stripes on my buttocks was the pure delight in his laughter. He howled and cooed with amusement. I hated him. I hated his cackle and his pagan pleasure. I hated his southern drawl and his piercing blue eyes. He became my most consistent and gleeful tormentor. He loved to grab my sprawling flesh in his hand and squeeze. He promised me that I would leave his camp thin and mean, and he was a man of his word. He squeezed me dry for 9 long, lonely, fearful weeks. I wrote that scene for the first time in my life. The men and women from the sexual abuse recovery group had stayed for a second week, read and heard my words. One person wept and another couldn't look at me. The conversation was intense and rich, and the questions that arose prompted me to begin to make connections I had not considered when I wrote the first draft. One person asked about my loss of innocence when I faced my father's manipulation. Another asked if I had noticed the contempt I seemed to have for that young boy's body. As the conversation continued, the group encouraged me to enter the terror that seemed to be laced with shame. As leader of the group, I felt it important to submit my writings to the others, but I had not expected such strong emotion as I read, nor knew the data that arose in the conversation. I had always thought of my stepfather as a quiet and passive man, but never as manipulative. Even my own writing didn't convince me. I had written it, but the words violated my image of my father. He may have been manipulative in that one scene, but he wasn't a manipulative man. The group asked me, "What do you have to give up if your image of your father changes?" As I pursued that question with a single sentence and then a paragraph and eventually many paragraphs, it opened my heart to new levels of being orphaned and of God hearing the cries of an orphan. My editors were inviting me to dig deeper and look at the broader implications of my story. They dug deep with me to unearth my father's manipulation, but I didn't want to see it as true. They went further and asked me to look at the horizon and name what it would cost me to take this journey to truth. When they asked me to name the cost, I was compelled to face a simple truth. My father used me to soothe and calm my mother when she was sad and upset. He confided in me, and I was his secret bearer, who helped keep the marriage intact and alive. He betrayed me. He set me up to keep secrets, which I had done so very well, even with regard to the abuse. I thought I had broken the silence and named the abuse by speaking and writing about it. I had, but I did not enter all the implications of the harm until I put the words on a page. A good editor will ask the horizon question, "Where is this journey taking you?" And the answer is always beyond what we can see. It is the same with words. We can never fully say all that is inside us. The more important it is, the more we stammer. But an editor presses us to peer beyond what we've said to where the words take us. An editor calls us to press harder and push beyond the agony of unbirthed words so that they can be spoken. Facing my father's manipulative betrayal helped me name a series of betrayals at the hands of older men, mentors, and leaders. What surprised me in the grief was the care of my Creator Father. He was neither surprised by nor afraid of my fury, nor did he allow me to ignore the story he had written in me through those losses. His kindness softened my heart and enabled me to begin to name the many times I had betrayed others just as I had been betrayed. Even in the deeper grief of my sin, God was neither surprised nor afraid of my shame. His presence, his strong embrace, melted away some of the glacial coldness in my heart. Yes, a good editor calls you to the horizon, where God has been waiting to receive you, as you journey back to his presence. It is this attraction of home that allows an editor to ask one of the hardest questions. So what? No doubt you've listened to someone tell a long, tiresome story, and you had to wonder, when will this ever end? Likewise, it's possible to listen to a great story and still wonder, what's the point? Both questions are really asking, so what? Whether the story is well told and interesting or more tedious than watching grass grow, we inevitably want to know the point. What am I to do with what I've just heard? Seldom will a piece of writing translate into an immediate concrete action. Perhaps reading a good stock tip might cause a person to go online and within minutes purchase the stock. But reading a poem, for instance, seldom rallies a reader to take immediate action. More likely, a poem, novel, or magazine article is read and enjoyed as a pleasure way to pass the time. It may add a few tidbits of information to our vast storehouse of facts before being promptly forgotten. What if we asked the question, so what, during and after every television show and movie and poem and novel? My guess is that we wouldn't waste as much time in the drivel of mere entertainment. By asking, so what, I enter the realm of meaning and creativity, and I am no longer a consumer. The question compels me to create and author my life in light of my own reading of the text. Imagine reading a poem, let alone writing one, and then asking these questions. What am I to become? If I am moved by something I've written or read, then what is it in my life that rose up in response? What is it about the way I live out my marriage, my friendships, or my job that was stirred by what I read or wrote? And if the reading or the writing failed to touch me, then what's missing? How do I get to the stories that transform my life? Good friends are editors who read our writing and hear our stories with an ear to answer the question underlying all these other questions. So what? As our reality is named, we are moved to ponder the implications of our story, but we can't stop there. We must also ask and be asked, what will you do with what you've written? If it moves you, will you move? And if you move, where will you go? What are the risks, and how will you know when you've arrived? Most of us don't invite a community of friends to know our story deeply enough to meaningfully engage the question, so what? The result is that our story, often our life, fails to move with integrity toward transformation. We will never change unless we risk action. We will never change unless we act in accord with the trajectory of our story. And friends who are good editors invite us to take that risk. While there is much to be seen in our story and much to be removed, depth is not the only concern. A good editor is also looking to expand our story to broaden our worldview. We need editing that helps us see the terrain on which we walk. Again, it is a matter of focus. I can look so closely at the details of my story that I forget about obtaining a more expansive view of my life. Clearly, an editor undertakes a paradoxical task. She or he helps you see the point of your story, but without becoming fixed on it. A good editor reminds the writer to press on to the end without becoming bound to what that end will be. There may be a sense of where work is going, but there are so many twists and turns in the process that the end must be honored and allowed to occur without our foreknowledge or interference. This calls us to persevering, relentless openness. It is where we must be as stubborn as a mule to wait for the story to be completed. And as we wait, it's good to remember that all endings are the sweet gift of a new beginning. Even the ending of this earth is but the beginning of the rest of eternity. Yet, an editor moves us to a temporary, incomplete ending. As relentless as we must be to leave the ending unattended, we must also unreservedly move toward an ending. We can't write forever. We must eventually risk by acting. And our risk is a solitary act. No friend, spouse, or comrade can walk with us in the risk of acting. Yes, God is with us, but his presence never takes away the necessity of risk and faith. The paradox is that as I write alone, I write for others. I am solely responsible for reading and writing my story well, for digging deep into the gaps, for finding the desire and passion and themes that God has written in my life. At the same time, I can't write alone. I am in community. For good and for ill, my story spills over to the lives of others. Even though our story spills into the lives of others, and even though everyone is fully involved in my becoming who I am, I can blame no one for my story. Is this a contradiction? I don't think so. The reason it is not contradictory is simple. I will be the only person who stands before the face of God to take account for my life. Many have influenced me, both for good and ill, but I will not be able to bring a small group before the throne of God and say, they are the ones who made me this way. We live as a one, but it is always a one formed by many. The pleasure of being a community of stories on this side of heaven is to mimic, poorly and incompletely, the day in which we will feast together on the stories of God. Let's turn now to a story feast. And there we have it. Chapter 8. Does it keep getting better and better? I mean, it's a book, right? It's a good book. And I think this is one of those books that when you're not in any sort of schooling, educational purpose, seeking a degree or taking a course or being told by some formal group in your community to read such a book, when you choose to read a book like this without being told, know that you're on the right path to becoming a better self and to understanding further what perhaps you're not meant to learn from a mass amount of, seeking in audience ways. This is why I'm also big into audiobooks. I don't have time to sit here behind the barn and read a book. I've wanted to read books all this time. Do you know what got me started reading these books? Was I started recording myself reading the books. And then, boom, right away, I was like, I'm going to read one chapter a day. I was all excited, so I started reading a chapter a day. Before you knew it, my first book, audio, video recorded for no other purpose other than really myself. And it did turn into me wanting to share with my mother, who has macular degeneration and can no longer read. And every day I was telling her about this good book, 3 bags full, about the sheep murder mystery. And she was like, oh. And I was like, Mom, I'm going to video it. I'm going to video myself. I'm going to read it for you, Mom. So you see all the steps involved for me to even audio record. There's no motive here. I'm not here for fame or fortune. I will continue to share that for the rest of my life. It's actually not bizarre. It's a beautiful knowing without thought that I'm here for far greater purposes, and for whatever reasons, I will continue to finish this book. We're already more than halfway through, and I'm enjoying it. Thank you for anybody else who's chiming in and enjoying hearing To Be Told by Dan B. Allender, PhD.